Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Christopher has lived in the countryside all his life and has never been to the city in his 28 years. After graduating from high school, he immediately trained as a tractor driver, and then his father got him a job. His life flowed, boring and monotonous. There was not much entertainment in the village. Young people went to the city, so even the young man had no friends left. His mother kept saying that the guy should also leave. In the village, you cannot even find a bride. The father was on the side of his son. He thought the boy should be closer to his parents. In a moment, or did she get fed up with it all? A school friend, Christopher Stephen, came to visit the parents. He lived next door, 2 grades younger. Of course, Christopher could not miss the opportunity to meet with his comrade. Stephen said that he had graduated from the institute and now worked in a cool firm. He came to introduce his fiancée to his parents. Stephen's girlfriend Adriana was a typical city dweller. She took pictures of herself, every tree from the barn to show her girlfriends. To observe the forgotten village, she was interested, but she could not live in such conditions. Both Adriana and Stephen looked at Christopher with sympathy and a little down on him. He didn't seem as modern and advanced as they were. "Why are you stewing here?" Christopher Stephen asked. "Move to the city. There are so many opportunities there and so much fun." "What about here?" "There's fresh air, stability." Christopher defended his country life. "Who needs me in the city? And here, who needs you for chicken dinner?" Made fun of the guy. Adriana: "Do you have anyone your own age around here?" "I haven't met anyone under 50 yet." Christopher shrugged. Perhaps he was the youngest of the residents. Stephen had invited a friend to the wedding, promised to show the town. He assured him that after that Christopher would never want to go back to his old life. The guy had long decided to go or not, but even his parents insisted that he could use a vacation. In the end, Christopher took out the only decent suit, which he had a jacket and pants left at him after the graduation party, on, cleaned his shoes, and went by train to a new unknown to him, the world of the big city. The first thing that caught his eye when he came out of the station was the fast traffic and turmoil. Everyone was in a hurry. Cars were passing by at breakneck speed. Christopher had never seen so many cars and people in one place. He walked along the streets and looked at advertising signs, mannequins in store windows, cozy courtyards, cafes. It was interesting for him to observe it all. To get to Stephen, Christopher got into a cab. "You look so puzzled, as if you just came out of a coma," laughed at him. Cab driver as a passenger: "Maybe I am," pensively answered Christopher, and continued to look at the street. "I am the first time in your city. It's beautiful here." "The city is like a city. Nothing special. Stores, eateries. That's all there is to it." The cab driver waved his hand. He went on to talk about the unnecessary number of shopping centers, that it would be nice if they made roads and so on. Was Christopher not listening to him? He was immersed in his emotions and thoughts. Suddenly he felt that this was his home, that he had nothing to do in the village. There he would only get bored out of his mind. Christopher wanted a normal family work, walks in the park. Christopher had only been in town for half an hour, but he knew he would be back here for good. Upon returning home, Christopher quickly packed his things, quit his job, said goodbye to his parents, and got ready to go. His mom was very happy for her son. Finally, he decided to do an adult thing. His father also accepted his son's decision and did not argue. The last representative of the youth was escorted around the village. Mom cried in part. Finally, the son became an adult and leaves the parents' nest. Father, however, was worried that Christopher, with his childlike naivety and simplicity, would be quickly deceived in the city. He was worried that his son would be tempted by the temptations of the city and get into some kind of trouble. Stephen helped a friend rent an apartment. Christopher found work quickly. He was a jack of all trades. The guy got a job in a construction crew, doing interior decoration. The pay was good, so he could afford a lot. Christopher quickly changed his closet to a more fashionable, made a haircut. A month later, only memories remained of the humble country boy. He quickly got into the rhythm of the city. He had friends with whom Christopher relaxed on weekends in bars. Not once did Christopher regret his decision. One day, his crew was sent to a rich house. Such cottages the young man had never seen before. 2 floors, a huge territory, a swimming pool. One can only dream of such a place. The owner was a grown woman named Betty. Her husband had passed away long ago, and now she was running his business. She was a typical business lady. One look at her made one uneasy. She gave instructions as well as the foreman, though even he was afraid of her and would not argue with her. Betty didn't have much respect for the workers. She demanded that they do everything faster, but without losing quality. She walked around the grounds and constantly pointed out small flaws. None of the construction workers liked her. Christopher thought that this woman was deeply unhappy. That's why she had such a fierce temper. He felt sorry for her for some reason. One day, Christopher was laying tiles in the pool. It was a hot July day. The sun was beating down. It was unbearably hard to work under those conditions. But Betty had ordered him to finish the pool by the end of the week. So Christopher tried to get it done as quickly as possible without losing quality. "Would you like to sing?" a gentle female voice asked. Christopher looked up and saw a beautiful young girl. She was about 25 years old. She was wearing a light or not nude dress, slightly developing wind, sandals on thin heels. Her hair was gathered in a braid over her shoulder. "I will not refuse," Christopher replied and accepted a glass of water from the hands of the beauty. When she leaned toward him to hand him the dress, he looked into her face. In appearance, she resembled Betty, but her features were softer and her eyes kinder. This was obviously her daughter. Apparently, she was not like her mother in personality either. She was attentive and very quiet. If Betty occupied all the space, the girl was quite inconspicuous. She spoke quietly and calmly. She spoke to everyone very meekly and respectfully. Several times during the day, the girl brought water, which was a lifesaver in this heat. Christopher noticed that sometimes he saw her silhouette in the window, and it seemed to him that she was looking at him. The fact that she offered only him a drink, he noticed it too. In the end, the guy pushed these thoughts away from himself because he did not think that such a girl could be interested in a simple worker. All the next week, the guy did not take his eyes off the beauty. He learned from his coworkers that the girl's name was Christina. She really was Betty's daughter. A lot of people noticed that she was showing interest in Christopher. She would offer him water or a cake. The boy was embarrassed by such a comment, but he was pleased. One day, he was about to go home after his shift. He heard a loud woman screaming. The sound didn't come from the house, but from the fence. There was no one around. Christopher was the last to leave. The girl ran in again. He decided to see what happened. Maybe someone needed help. The young man went around the fence and saw Christina surrounded by a whole pack of dogs. There were at least 10 of them. Each one bared its teeth in a vicious grin. Christina stood pale with fear, with the brick fence behind her. There was nowhere for her to retreat to. Christopher, not thinking long, looked around, found a long stick, and shouted loudly, "Get out of here." The guy walked straight toward the pack, waving the stick from side to side. Dogs are evil, or they were bailed out. But they were scared. One dog ran away first, and all the others ran away after him. "Thank you, rest," thanked Christina. "I have been afraid of dogs since childhood. I was once bitten by a neighbor's Rottweiler. It scared me for life." Christina lifted her skirt to show the bite. The scar was impressive, but Christopher was more attracted by the slender leg that the girl exposed. He even blushed with embarrassment. "Come on. Anyone would do the same," he said. "My name is Christopher, by the way. I guess we can get acquainted now." "Christina," the girl replied, smiling. "Maybe I'll buy you coffee or dinner." As a sign of gratitude, Christopher did not refuse to spend the evening in the company of a pretty girl is always nice. To dinner. He, of course, did not let her pay, although the amount in the check was impressive. Christina chose restaurants to her taste, and she was accustomed to all the best. After that evening, the guy had to squeeze hard financially to reach his paycheck. They talked all evening as if they had known each other for a long time. Christina listened with interest about village life. It was all a wonder for her. The girl told little about herself. She decided not to embarrass a simple guy with stories about the happy and carefree childhood of a child from a rich family. She had never faced any difficulties in life. The only tragedy in her fate was the death of her father. Her dad was into extreme sports. This led to the man's death. He crashed on a motorcycle. So now Christina was wary of two-wheeled transportation. Even bicycles she tried to avoid. After the tragedy, her mother became even tougher than she'd been before. She just lost her mind. She felt like the head of the family, even though she'd been in charge most of the time when her husband was alive. When Christopher returned home, looked at his bachelor's humble abode, his head was filled with sad thoughts. He liked Christina very much, but he realized that this girl was not at all on his level. She would never seriously consider tying her life to him. He would have to look at girls more simple, like those he meets in clubs. With Christina, he spent 2 weeks' worth of his budget in one night. The next day, Christopher didn't notice Christina. He figured the girl was embarrassed about last night's date and would avoid him from now on. The shift was noticeably duller without her. The coworkers also noticed that no one offered water or a skewer to the guy today. They were teasing Christopher, but he paid no attention to these barbs. He wanted to finish his work as soon as possible to complete this project and forget about Christina forever. The girl, however, did not regret the date in the slightest. She liked Christopher too, and unlike him, she had no prejudices about the difference in their social status. Of course, she had noticed the way his eyes had rounded when the waiter brought the bill. She had no illusions about the earnings of a mere construction worker, but the girl was pleased with the gesture that Christopher had performed. She didn't come to the construction site not because she was hiding from the young man. It was just that her friend had a wedding, and where Christina was a witness. She had no idea that her absence would make Christopher so sad. When Christopher saw Christina the next day, he couldn't contain his smile. It formed on his face. The girl responded in the same way. Both were a little embarrassed by their unexpected joy. "Why didn't I see you yesterday?" said Christopher, trying to contain his embarrassment. "My best friend was getting married," the girl shared the news. "Imagine, I caught the bride's bouquet." "Your boyfriend must have been happy," joked Christopher. Thus, he decided to find out if Christina had a suitor. He was embarrassed to ask directly. "I am a free girl," she replied and winked. "I will wait for my soulmate to show up." Christopher was pleased with this information. By the way, Christina was flirting with him. He guessed that she didn't mind accepting advances from him. Her smile and wink were quite unmistakable. Christopher took it as a sign. If the girl herself showed interest in him, he should take a risk and try to get her. Christina liked Christopher's modesty, his shyness, and simplicity. The guys in her circle were quite different. They were all arrogant, narcissistic. None of her acquaintances would give up their last dime for a favorite bill. They loved as much as they loved themselves. That's why the simple guy Christopher seemed so interesting to her. Buying a bouquet for him was an act. And those gorgeous flowers she received from other suitors, not for her, not for them, meant nothing. From that moment on, Christopher no longer shied away from anyone or hid his sympathy from his coworkers at their comments. He didn't care. He gave Christina flowers, took her to movies and restaurants. Yes, for this he had to touch his deferred money, which he planned to spend on buying a house. But Christina deserved the best. She wasn't the type who would be satisfied with a walk in the park and a daisy from the field. The girl accepted courtship, happily agreed to meetings. In fact, she did not really care what restaurant Christopher would take her to. But it was nice that he tried to please. The renovation of Christina's house was already finished. Christopher's crew had moved on to the next project, but their communication continued. 3 months into their relationship, Christopher proposed to Christina. He decided not to delay long. The guy determined that she was the girl with whom he wanted to spend the rest of his life. Christina said yes. It seemed to her that Christopher is a worthy man. He is kind, caring, such a great husband and father. He could always be counted on. He treated her with such attention and care that it was impossible not to fall in love with him. So the omen with the bouquet really works. Christina laughed. How quickly she found a husband. I realized the first time we met that I want to share my life with you, Christopher confessed. And your story about the bouquet just became for me a sign from above that it is impossible to miss such a chance. The lovers were happy. They were in no hurry to get married. They wanted to stay longer in the status of bride and groom, to rejoice in this romance, to enjoy each other. The wedding day was appointed only in 3 months to have time to prepare. Christina procrastinated for a very long time, and only one moment of the groom's acquaintance with his mother. Betty's character was not sugar. The girl herself tolerated a lot of claims from her. The woman had a whole list of requirements for her future son-in-law, and one of the first items was material well-being. Christopher flew straight through. He wasn't a pauper. But for Betty, anyone who didn't have a couple 1 million in his account was considered poor, unworthy in the views of a daughter. Betty did not believe in love. She herself was marrying out of convenience. So, for her own blood, she saw no other way. Christina was hesitant to admit that she was in a relationship with a young man, and if Mom finds out that they are already preparing for the wedding, she will be furious. And so, in fact, it happened. One day, Christina decided that she can no longer hide the truth from her mother. She is a grown-up girl and can choose for herself who is worthy of her hand and who is not. But the girl decided first to talk to her mother herself, and then to present the groom. How many expensive sets were broken this morning? What eloquent speeches were heard from the people of the houses nearby? As soon as Christina mentioned the engagement, I put so much effort into you to get you involved with some construction worker, yelled Betty, already spewed out the first wave of emotions. I don't want to live my whole life with a man I hate, do you? Resisted Christina. You think I don't know how you really felt about Daddy. You lived as neighbors, business partners, but not a happy couple. I want to understand what love is, to feel what it's like to be loved by a woman. Have you ever felt that way in your life? He's not your equal, that's it. Mother Love insisted. These are fairy tales for little fools. When you wake up in a cheap apartment to the sound of a singing faucet, then you'll remember what I said. You have never seen what poverty is, when in the store you choose what is cheaper, when your socks are torn and you start to sew them up, because there is no money for new ones. You only have extremes in everything, either untold riches or absolute poverty and carrots on holidays. I laughed at Christina's mom. We've already applied to the registry office, so your opinion doesn't matter. Betty blushed to the tips of her ears. Her anger made it hard for her to breathe. But the woman knew that her daughter was as stubborn as she was. It was useless to argue with him. The woman hoped that her daughter would realize that she had made the wrong choice. We just have to wait. And I hope he didn't get you pregnant. What's the rush? She asked her daughter. Christina didn't even want to answer that question. She left to give her mom time to exhale and think again. She was not going to give up on her decision. Christina did not talk about her mom's violent reaction to the news of their engagement. The guy and himself guessed that she was not delighted. Therefore, unnecessary questions did not ask. His parents were happy for their son, but with the bride he did not hurry to introduce them to. Christopher thought that Christina was not yet ready to plunge into the life of the village. He decided to wait for us from the day of the wedding. That's where he would introduce Mom and Dad to his wife. Unfortunately, Christina never recognized her new relatives. Just a month before the celebration, Christopher got some sad news. There was a fire in his house. It happened at night. The parents didn't even realize it. They both suffocated from the smoke. Both died. Christopher felt responsible for their deaths. If he hadn't left his parents, he would have saved them. The guy became depressed, And if it wasn't for Christina, he would never have gotten out of that hole. The girl supported him. She was able to convince her lover that he was innocent of what happened. They certainly wouldn't want him to feel that way. When Christopher arrived at the funeral, he found that there was almost nothing left of the house. It had been completely burned down. The boy said goodbye to the village forever. There was nothing left to keep him here now. He got a payout from the insurance company. It was a modest sum, but the money was enough for a small studio apartment near the city center. There they began to live with Christina after the wedding. The girl remembered her mother's words about a tiny apartment with a broken faucet, but did not worry about it. "We will still have everything," she thought. She had not yet plunged into the problems of living together. She was a happy young wife. The couple's romantic period continued. It was time to inform Betty that Christina had become Christopher's wife. The girl hoped that her mother would not oppose it now. After all, everything was already done. She mentally prepared herself and Christopher for a difficult meeting, and they went to her mom. "You're not my daughter anymore." That's all Betty said when she heard the news of the marriage. "You can't count on me to help you. If you want heaven in a tent, you can have it." Christina tried to talk some sense into her mother. Explained to her that not everything in this life is measured by bank accounts. She said she'd never been happier with anyone than she was with Christopher. Betty called her daughter's words nonsense and told her to come home only when she got rid of that construction worker. She didn't want to listen to anything else. Christopher did not expect to hear anything else from a demanding woman. Christina was more upset than her spouse. She was offended for him. Mom did not even try to find out what a wonderful person her new husband was. The conversation ended on raised tones. The daughter announced that she herself did not want to know her mother anymore. "Many, she will not be in this house." Time passed. The romance of the first weeks of marriage slowly faded. Christina didn't work anywhere. She never did. Christopher, on the other hand, spent all day at the construction site to provide for his wife. She had many demands. Gradually, the number of gifts began to decrease. Christopher was dissatisfied with the fact that his wife sits all day and does nothing. But he never talked about it. He would come home after long shifts, run the laundry himself, scrub the floors, and cook dinner. His love was so strong that he was willing to put up with it all. The girl was slowly fading away. The veil of love matched her eyes. She felt real life. The money on the card, which was still left from her mother, began to run out quickly. After all, no one else had replenished it. And the young wife did not refuse from the usual spending. Christina began to look at her friends with envy. They continued to travel several times a year, buy things from expensive brands, regularly visit a beautician. Christina had to forget about all this. The joy of life. Christina returned pleasant news. The girl was pregnant. Christopher jumped to the ceiling when he learned that soon to become a father. One thing was sad: parents never lived to see grandchildren. They were happy with the good news. Christopher presented Christina with a diamond ring. It was the most expensive gift from him for all the time of their relationship. The girl decided that the news about the future grandchild would melt the heart of Betty, with whom Christina had not communicated for 2 years. The woman missed her daughter, but was too principled and stubborn to make contact and accept her daughter's choice. She waited for her call, but expected to hear that her daughter was coming home. But no way. News that Christina has decided to also have a baby from this beggar's belief. Get an abortion before it's too late. That's all Betty replied to her daughter's message. "It's too late, Mom. We even found out the sex of the baby. We're having a boy," announced Christina, who was in shock. She didn't think her mom would be so uncomfortable with her decision. "So it will be the most unhappy child in the world, whose mother is a fool, whose father is a moron," Betty declared and hung up the phone. Christina decided that she would not call her mother again. Such words sorry, and could not. The girl cried, but not from resentment, but from anger. To realize that your mother is such a mercantile person was very hard. "Christopher." The girl said that her mom just congratulated them on the addition, but refused to help. The girl decided not to go into details of the conversation, so as not to offend her beloved. The joy of pregnancy at Christina passed very quickly. It was hard for her. Cabs and constant pharmacies complicated the already difficult life. There was barely enough money for 2 people. How would they pull an infant as well? Christina didn't understand, or she had to take on even more part-time work. He was pulling the family alone. The girl stopped feeling the happiness of waiting for the baby. He had not yet come into the world, and Christina already considered him a burden. She counted on her mother to laugh at her and forgive her. After all, this is her first and perhaps only grandchild. But Mom's refusal to help drove Christina into depression and even despair. She spent hours looking at baby products, calculated how much money would be needed. Her hair was becoming frizzy from the prices. One day, Christina received a call from her mother. The woman apologized for her harsh statements and invited her daughter to visit. The girl happily agreed to meet. Already in half an hour, she stood on the threshold of her native house. Finally, the mother came to her senses. Now Christina's life will get better, and she will not need to count pennies. Choose whether you need a bathing chair or a high chair. Betty met her daughter kindly and even hugged her. Such tenderness from her mother Christina did not remember even in good times. The woman invited her daughter to the table. She got right down to business. Christina, of course I did wrong, Betty began to say, and I'm happy to have a grandchild. You're my only daughter. As soon as I saw you with that cute little belly, my heart melted. I'm very happy to hear that, the girl replied. But I still can't accept your husband, what he can give you and the baby. So I propose the following to you. You leave Christopher, you move in with me. All the expenses for your maintenance and the child will be on me. Christina thought about it. She didn't mind giving up her love for money. Living in a studio apartment and doing household chores was not to her liking. Her sense of pride was dulled. The desire for a beautiful life. Restaurants, resorts, brand-name clothes. Betty was right. Everything is a comparison. The woman noticed that her daughter was thinking, not hysterical as she had been earlier. That fact pleased the mother. So, not all is not lost yet. And she continued talking. One more condition. But that's not all. And I found you a proper fiancé. He's my business partner. He was widowed 3 years ago. Never found a new partner. I'm asking about you, by the way. You'll marry him. You'll be in business for yourself, and you can help me. Christina's expression changed dramatically. She wasn't happy with that. She had hoped for things to be as they were before she got married. Why couldn't her mom just treat her like a daughter and not a business project? She's willing to put Christina under a creepy man 15 years older than her for her career. Mom, did you know that he was widowed because he killed his spouse? Christina asked. It has not been proven yet. Unperturbedly answered the mother. It won't be. With his connections and opportunities, only it won't bring the woman back. And everyone knows the story, including you. And this isn't the first time he's ruined a human soul. You're willing to sacrifice me to add paranoia to your account. Did you hear my offer? If you don't agree, go back to your doghouse. Betty replied just as indifferently. Christina was angry at her mother again. Only she had thought that everything would be as before. How her dreams were shattered by her mother's vanity. She glared at her, but didn't leave. Fine, you don't want to. Suit yourself. Waved his hand at Betty. Let's at least have tea. You probably haven't tasted normal tea in 100 years. The woman waved her hand to the servants to serve the tea. The governess obediently brought a tray with 2 cups from an expensive china set. She made some sign to Betty and left the room. Well, what's your happiness and the baby's health? Mom said, and raised her glass playfully. Christina rolled her eyes. This ceremony in Mom always annoyed her. Betty always had to keep her face and act as pathos as possible. Her daughter played along and touched her heavier. I'm going home, said the girl T. Wait, it's been so long since we've seen you. At least tell me how you're doing. Betty watched her daughter carefully as she drank the drink. She didn't calm down until the girl took the last sip. Christina noticed it, but she was already used to her mom acting very strange sometimes, so she didn't pay much attention to such behavior. Now, however, it seemed to Christina that her mom purposely wanted to keep her home longer. She couldn't. Jean put something in her tea. Christina sat at her mother's for the second hour. Her mother's monotonous stories about rich friends and their children had bored her to tears. Betty was telling her who had married whom, some favorable match. She was still trying to make her think it was a marriage of convenience. In the circles of people like her, that's the norm. Christina's patience ran out. She hailed a cab and said goodbye to her mom. Suddenly, Betty grabbed her stomach and screamed loudly. "Mom, what happened?" The girl was frightened. "I don't know. I feel dizzy and my stomach hurts a lot," the woman replied. Suddenly, a trace of blood began to form on her snow-white pants. The stain increased right before her eyes. Christina immediately called an ambulance. She was very scared for her mom. The girl went to the hospital with her. By the time the ambulance arrived, Betty had lost consciousness. Christina walked from side to side in the hospital corridor. The girl couldn't understand what had happened to her mother. She looked perfectly healthy. She behaved as usual. Finally, the doctor came out to see her. The girl immediately rushed towards him. "Your mom is bleeding," said the doctor. "It's nothing. We stopped it. She's gonna be fine." Why did this happen to her? She's never had any problems like this with her health. That woman was as careful as anyone. She'd have prevented any disease from happening in the first place. Probably some kind of hormonal disruption. The doctor replied. "Can you go in and see her?" Christina went into the room. Betty lay pale enough to blend into the white blanket, which was open to her chin. Despite her obvious weakness, she was telling someone off on the phone. Her voice was quiet, but still stern. "You couldn't give me a proper sign, like marking the mug, and I didn't go to the other side of the world," screamed Mom to the best of her ability into the phone. Somebody gave a quick squeak in a lefty, guilty voice. But the words were indecipherable. Betty's eyes, and covered with hatred and anger, "You're fired. From this very moment, and don't expect any compensation. You will receive a recommendation accordingly." The woman hung up, and only at that moment she noticed that Christina was standing next to her. The girl had heard the whole conversation. It began to dawn on her. Why did Mom feel so bad, and why should it have been her? "You wanted to put something in my tea, and I understand correctly?" Christina asked sternly. "My girl, is it not what you think it is?" Betty started making excuses. Christina and no one else had ever seen such a look on that woman's face. Betty was startled and felt guilty. Her eyes ran from side to side in confusion. "Judging by the nature of your bleeding, you wanted to take my baby away from me. You wanted to induce a miscarriage, did you?" Christina asked even more sternly. Betty began to mumble something inaudible, and the girl realized that she was right. That realization just robbed her of any feelings for her mother. "How could you? That's your grandson. Do you realize how far along I am? It's killing a living person. I'm sorry, just me," the mother said, tears spurting from her eyes. That's when Betty really realized what she had done. She stared at the table, angry with horror at her daughter, who looked at her like a wild animal. The woman felt like a monster. It became unbearable for her. Disgusted with herself and ashamed, she could not find words to justify herself. She just opened her mouth like a fish thrown on dry land. Christina abruptly left the room so that her mother would not see her tears. She realized firmly that she would never speak to her again. Of course, Christina was no angel either. Even in the morning, she was ready to leave the man she loved for money and a rich life, but she would never dare to kill. The girl returned home completely devastated. Christopher was frightened when he saw his beloved in such a state. Christina did not tell him anything. She was ashamed of her mother. In the evening, Christina felt sick. Her blood pressure was high and her stomach was very tight. Christopher was frightened for his pregnant wife and immediately called a doctor. Christina was put in the hospital for preservation. The girl had a threat of miscarriage. She blamed it on her mother, who almost got what she wanted. What she wanted. I couldn't get my head around it. How Betty could even think of such a thing. Christopher visited his wife every day. He always brought her flowers and treats, but Christina didn't need anything anymore. In the ward, she met the other boys-to-be. They bragged about gifts from their husbands. They told about the renovation of the nursery, how many things they bought. It was very hard for Christina to listen to this. Her child won't even have his own room. She couldn't afford to buy him 3 outfits a day. Christopher was doing everything in his power to provide the family with everything they needed, but he could not satisfy all of Christina's desires. The man began to notice that his wife is withering. What was the reason for her sadness? He didn't understand. He kept telling her not to be nervous. See what you've done to yourself. In an instant, Christina, I'm sick of it all. How can I not be nervous when I realize my child will never go to a good school? He won't have fancy clothes or good food. We won't be able to show him the world. The girl spoke up. And if both parents worked in our family, maybe we could afford more. For the first time in his life, Christopher reproached his wife for something, but he was offended to hear her claims. She knew she wasn't marrying a millionaire. Christina was dumbfounded by such words. She had never been forced to work in her life. She had never thought that she would get up early in the morning to go to some office, to get there through traffic. Although Christopher was right about one thing, she really did know who to marry. The most frustrating part of it all was admitting that Mom was right. After this situation, Betty tried several more times to reconcile with her daughter. She accepted her pregnancy and forgave her choice of a poor spouse, and was ready to help financially. But Christina didn't want to hear from her. And I didn't understand why the girl was acting like that. She dreamed that her mother was interested in her grandchild, and now she ignores her. He tried to ask a couple of times what caused such a drastic change. But by Christina's stern answers, I realized that it was better not to get involved in their family squabbles. 2 months later, Christina and Christopher had a son. They named him John. The boy was born 2 weeks premature. The girl believed that the premature birth was the fault of her mother, who made her very nervous. She never forgave her. One day, Christopher had the opportunity to rest and volunteered to go for a walk with his son. Christina gladly accepted such an offer. She could finally devote a few hours only to her beloved. The man did it for a reason. Betty had talked him into it. She wanted to see her grandson very badly. The reason for the mother-daughter conflict remained a mystery to Christopher. Betty dared when she saw her grandson. She didn't take her eyes off him for a moment. He looks a lot like Christina, she said. There's nothing of yours in him at all. John is too young to judge who he looks more like. Christopher replied resentfully. And I want to have a serious talk with you. Betty said in a tone that wasn't cute at all. You realize it's just Christina's life. She deserves more than that. And you put her in a room you call an apartment and keep her there. What are you implying? With suspicion, Christopher asked. I'll pay you any amount you name. And if you file for divorce, don't worry about the formalities. We will bypass all the laws. Christopher almost fell over when he heard such an offer. He was hoping that things would get better with his mother-in-law. She's starting her song again. Isn't it about time she accepted her daughter's choice? As far as I know, Christopher answered. Christina doesn't even want to hear your name. How are you going to get her back in the Duma? I will repeat to you what Christina once told you. Not everything is measured in money. If she hasn't left me yet, she's happy with me. You and your riches have lost her, mind you. And I don't keep her chained up in a room, as you put it. After that, Christopher never brought his grandson to his mother-in-law again. He couldn't understand people like her. Betty drove her daughter away herself. Was it really that important to her that she not be with Christopher? As time went on, John grew, developed. The boy was a year old now. Life seemed to be getting better. Christopher had almost saved up for a new apartment. In a few months, they were planning to move in. But their dreams were not to be realized. One day, Christopher didn't come home from work. Christina waited for him until 3 o'clock. She drew different pictures in her imagination. At first, she thought something had happened to him. Then, for some reason, she thought that Christopher must have gotten held up with some lady. Finally, she came to the conclusion that her husband had simply traded her for a group of friends with entertaining drinks. Women's imagination has no limits. Finally, the girl's patience broke down, and she decided to simply call her spouse. She was answered by a doctor from the hospital and reported that Christopher is in surgery. A concrete slab had fallen on his legs. There's a simple fracture in one leg, nothing serious, but the other bone is completely shattered. It's gonna take the man a long time to recover. It's not certain he'll ever be able to walk again. Christina lost her temper when she heard what had happened. She quickly packed her slide and left him with a neighbor. She herself ran to the hospital to see her spouse. When she saw him, whole rivers and tears ran down her cheeks. Even though the doctor said only his legs were hurt, Christopher's whole appearance was ghastly. Huge bruises sat under his eyes. His arms were renamed. She took his hand and looked straight into his eyes. "Hold on. I'm here for you," she told her lover. He tried to smile back, but it was hard for him to do so. For Christina, it was a blow to the heart. Dreams of a happy life, of a new large apartment shattered. The money set aside to buy a home had to be given to treatment and recovery, or Christina hated the whole world during this period of her life. It would seem that tragedy should have brought husband and wife together. But for some reason, Christina became estranged from her spouse. It was a burden to care for him. Not only did little John require a lot of attention, now Christopher could not even wash himself. The girl simply unlearned from all the troubles that fell to her share. It took 1.5 years before he was able to stand on his feet. Now he was an invalid. To work as before, the man could not, of course, work. Christina's pride evaporated. She forgave her mother. She began to accept help from her. Betty was glad that her daughter finally turned to her, although the occasion was not the happiest. She never said anything bad about Christopher again. The woman was glad that she was able to communicate with her grandson, albeit in this way. One day, Christina wondered, hadn't her mother built this tragedy? After what she wanted to do to John, the girl could expect anything from her. She didn't beat around the bush. "Well, be honest, you didn't have anything to do with what happened to Christopher, did you?" she asked. Betty pulled her eyes away. This time she was genuinely surprised, something she hadn't expected from her daughter. "I'm quite the monster you think I am. I didn't even know what happened until you told me," she replied. Christina still decided that indeed it was too harsh even for her mom. Such thoughts never entered her head again. Christopher required care. A lot of Christina's time and energy went into helping her spouse. At one point, she got tired of it all. When Christopher was able to look after himself and even take care of his son, Christina began to leave home more often. She spent a lot of time in the company of her girlfriends, partying in nightclubs. Betty gave money to support John, and Christina went down on the entertainment. One day, she announced to Christopher that she was leaving him. She packed John her belongings and left her invalid husband alone. Left to himself, Christopher lost any meaning in life. The man found solace in a bottle of liquor. I myself did not notice how evenings in the company of alcoholic beverages became a constant for him. First he drank a little, then more and more, till he drank himself to death. He wasn't allowed to see his son. Betty tried to get him and Christina divorced as quickly as possible. Christopher tried to get John to see him more than once a month, but his ex-wife said she would terminate his parental rights if he continued to meddle in their lives. Christopher believed it was Betty who had sentenced Christina to do this to an unhappy man. She had never loved Christopher. She was always against their relationship. He even wanted to end it, but he didn't have the resolve. It's been 2 years since the divorce. Had Christopher lost his humanity? Neighbors called him the local drunk. No one wanted to hang out with him. So there was nothing left for the man to do but sink further to the social bottom. One of the next alcoholic evenings was revealed by a ringing doorbell. Christopher opened the door and rubbed his eyes to make sure he was not imagining things. Standing outside the door was Christina, her mother. The look on their faces was strained, friendly. They were smiling strangely. Obviously, this couple couldn't just show up at his door. "Hey, Christopher, how are you doing?" Betty asked, or was surprised by the man's unexpected courtesy. "Did you kill someone and want me to take the blame?" Christina and her mother looked at each other strangely, a little frightened. Then both of them simultaneously shifted their gaze to Christopher. The women were creeped out by the question, for he had hit the mark. They were in very serious trouble indeed. "Did I guess that?" Christopher was amazed. "Honestly, I don't even know where to begin." "I'm not sure," Christina said. "You've always been a compassionate person, amazingly kind. I've never met anyone like you. You've always done everything you could for me and more. How wonderful I am. I don't need you to tell me. Let's get down to business." Christopher couldn't take the hypocrisy of his ex-wife. He didn't really hold a grudge against Christina. The man realized that Betty was in charge of everything. She was the one who'd persuaded him to leave his destitute, invalid husband. In some ways, he even agreed with her. Of course, a girl like Christina deserved better. Christopher simply couldn't give her the life she wanted. "Yes, Christina. Let's resolve this issue quickly." Betty agreed with her son-in-law. "And I'm in trouble. I need your help. A few hours ago, I hit a man with my car. It was some drunk. He had no family, but he was still alive," Christina said. "He was," Christopher pointed out. "Yes, he died on the way to the hospital," Christina continued. "Mom asked the coroner to hold off for now. You see, Christopher, I can't go to jail. I have a son, a career. A criminal record would just wipe out everything I've worked for over the years. I get it. You want me to go to jail. I mean, I got no son, nothing to lose. Is that what you think?" Christopher was angry about. "Look at you. What kind of life is this? You have no job, no status." Betty stepped in. "I'll make you a deal. You'll have great cell conditions when you get out. You can see John as much as you want. Help Christina. Prison will ruin her whole life. Is this a chance for you to get your life back on track?" Of course, Christopher was unpleasant to hear himself say that, but Betty said that's right. The man's reputation had long since sunk below the minimum. Other than the Georgia bottle, he had no interlocutors. What did he care where to stare at the ceiling here, within four walls or in a jail cell? Against all his beliefs, Christopher agreed to help his ex-wife one more time. He took the blame. Christopher regretted his decision several times. He doubted that Christina really deserved such an act from him. When his husband was in a bad situation, she turned her back on him. She hadn't given him the support he needed. Why should he have to deal with her problems now? But it was too late to back down. He was the guilty party in the case. There was no going back. Let this be his payback for his naivety and kindness. Christopher was sentenced to 5 years. He was given the minimum because he pleaded not guilty, confessed to driving drunk without noticing. No idea where you were running from. He was completely remorseful. Betty's connections, of course. Christina even came to see him on a date at first. It was only a couple times. Thanked him for his help. Showed him pictures of her son. Christopher was even glad to be able to talk to her like that. He was starting to dream that when he got out, he'd get back together with her. They would live happily ever after. After his act, Betty warmed a little to her son-in-law. Then the visit and Christina suddenly stopped. Christopher was very worried about it. Every day he hoped that the warden would come and inform him that a beautiful woman, the mother of his child, was waiting for him. But Christina never came. When Christopher had finally given up hope of ever seeing his beloved again, he received a letter. On the envelope he read the name of the woman he dreamed of every day. It was a letter from Christina. She apologized that she could no longer visit him, told him how she had grown older. John shared his worries and even confessed her love. Christopher then slept with that letter under his pillow for another week, until he got a new one. it was even more tender. The man treasured all the letters he received from Christina. She wrote to him often, once or twice a week. They began to correspond. The woman sent him a picture of her son, which he hung over his bed. Christopher admired the son, remarked how much he looked like him. But there were traits of his mom too. He asked Christina to send him a picture of herself, but she refused. Said she didn't want other inmates looking at her. Christopher served his sentence in a colony where the regime was not very strict. Some prisoners even managed to sneak a cell phone. Once he asked one of them for a gadget. He had to give his rations to a criminal for 5 minutes of internet access for 2 months. Christopher went to Christina's social networking page. There he saw pictures of her on vacation. The man was surprised, because in her letters she did not tell that she flew to the sea. But he decided that she just did not want to alarm or upset him. For now he lay on a hard window pane and saw the sun only through the small window of his cell. It was basking beside the lascivious sea. Christopher again felt the harsh injustice of his situation, but dreams of his beloved dispelled his misery. Christina wrote that she missed him. The girl repented for leaving Christopher. She said she was waiting for him. Christopher himself had already begun to count the days until his release. The man dreamed of how they would be together again when he was released, how he would hug and kiss his beloved. The sentence stretched unbearably long in these dreams, and it seemed that it would never end. In prison, Christopher had only one contact with one person. It was a very young guy of 19 years old. He went to prison a year after Christopher. All this time, the man stayed away from the other prisoners. He was a loner. The frightened boy immediately caught Christopher's eye. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked for someone who didn't cause him fear. And he came upon Christopher, who was also scrutinizing him. The man himself approached the new prisoner and started a conversation with him. The guy's name was Robert. He was sentenced to 7 years. He had been sentenced for major fraud. He worked in a bank. He was an ordinary manager, making loans. The boss framed the young man, sent the young man to ruin his youth behind bars, and he got away with it and went to a warm country. Christopher didn't like injustice. He felt sorry for Robert. He understood perfectly well what it was like to be in such a place when you were not guilty of anything. The kid's mom was still out there. The woman worked as a simple cleaning lady. Of course, they didn't have money for good lawyers. And the pro bono lawyers didn't care much about their clients. They decided to stick together. Christopher thought the young man was taking the hardships of his imprisonment more and more seriously. No one wrote him letters. His mother was too ill to come this far away. Robert had no girlfriend, or at least the feeling that a woman he loved was waiting for him in freedom. Robert had nothing that would question his imprisonment and give him the strength to live. But 5 years later, Christopher woke up feeling like a free man. The last time he'd managed in this hated place. The last time he ate a tasteless breakfast of porridge. The last time he went through the humiliating inspection procedure. The gates to a happy new life opened before him. Somewhere out there in the city, Christina is waiting for him. She promised to cook him puffed pies on the stove, to boil that borscht. But it wasn't dinner he was waiting for. His dreams were all about her. The woman he had stood up for, saved from imprisonment. How many humiliations of all kinds he had to endure to finally be rewarded. The kiss and embrace of the woman he loved. Robert was sorry to say goodbye to his only friend in this unfortunate place. Now he was left here all alone. Was Christopher worried about the boy too? He was to spend another 3 years in prison. Now he had no companionship. He was going to have a much harder time. Christopher decided to write him letters so that Robert wouldn't die of loneliness. No one met him at the gate, not even a cab, but he was not upset. Nothing could upset him that day. Encouraged by his loving reverie, he walked to town. Christopher watched nature, which was just waking up from its winter hibernation. He looked at this forest every day through the cell window, and it seemed so distant and uncriminal to him. And now he stood next to these trees, could touch them, smell the fresh resin. Even the sky beyond the fence was fresher and cleaner. The grass wasn't interpreted by a dozen mere criminals. It grew along the road, untouched by anyone. The man walked without looking around. He had only one goal, after all, to get to town as soon as possible. But suddenly he heard someone crying. Christopher tried to ignore it and went on, but the sound only grew stronger. The man could no longer ignore it. It sounded like a woman crying. He looked carefully deep into the forest and noticed some movement there. Christopher went towards this moving. After walking a few steps forward, Christopher realized that there was a man there. He approached again and froze. There was an old woman sitting by a tree. She looked very unhappy and shabby. She had evidently spent several days in the woods. Her face was sooty, clothes in hibernation on and torn in several places. "Grandma, what happened to you?" "Careful," he asked. The old lady did not answer. She was disoriented, did not even notice that someone approached her. Christopher came closer. He tried not to scare her too much. Finally, she turned her attention to him. Her eyes were distraught. She did them a few times and squinted to get a better look at the approaching man. "Are you an illusion or a real person?" In disbelief, she asked. "Real you can touch," good-naturedly replied Christopher. "What are you doing here?" Grandma said that 3 days ago she went into the forest, but she couldn't get out of it. She got lost. Christopher calmed her down, said that she was just a few steps from the road, but the old woman had given up hope of rescue. She gave up and sat down under a tree to die in peace. "Death is canceled for today," Christopher announced cheerfully. "You must be very hungry." He took out a bun from his pocket, which he had left from breakfast. Christopher hoped, of course, that Christina would come for him, but he didn't count on her much, so he decided to take some bread with him on the road just in case. It was a good thing he hadn't gotten hungry yet. Grandmother greedily chewed on the lush rebellion. Prison bread was not tasty, but after so many days of starvation, it seemed like a delicacy to Grandma. "I think we should get out of here," Christopher suggested. The old woman nodded obediently. She wanted it just as much. Christopher led Granny out of the woods. She was surprised to notice that she was actually going to die. Just 20 paces from the road, Christopher told her he was on his way to see his beloved. The old lady remembered that she had once had love. She said it was a feeling that had to be fought for. It was the only thing that gave life meaning. Did Christopher agree with her? If it wasn't for Christina's letters in prison, he wouldn't have survived. They gave him moral support. Fortunately, about 15 minutes into their journey, a car drove down the road. The driver agreed to give the grandmother a ride into town. Christopher did not fit into the car, but he was not upset and continued on foot. Christopher did not notice how he passed 10 kilometers on the road and found himself near the city. How much did he miss the noise of the construction site? Car horns, snippets of conversation. How many people are there? Everyone's got their own families to worry about. Everyone's in a hurry. Christopher walked alone and scrutinized the faces, different from those of his fellow inmates. The man had a similar feeling the day he first got out of his village. There, too, he had been imprisoned. Now he felt that pleasant sense of freedom. With all his legs, Christopher rushed to the cherished house where they had first met, where he'd been barred for years and years before prison. To Christina's house, where she was already waiting for him with promises and pies, where his son lives, already very grown up. Even the inevitable meeting with his hated mother-in-law didn't dampen his mood. An hour later, Christopher pressed the bell. His heart was ready to fly out of his chest. He was anxious. 1,000 times he imagined this meeting and couldn't believe he had waited for this moment. Finally, the door opened, but behind it stood a different woman than the one he had dreamed of meeting. The door had been created by Betty herself, not even sent a governess to do the job. "Well, hello, Vitek," jokingly and even affably greeted Betty. "You're free already." No, they let him out for a walk. Christopher was burning with impatience. "Where's Christina?" "She's not here." "Don't take this the wrong way, but don't come here again." Instantly, Christopher's world went black and white again. What's that old Nigra up to again? How many times can you mix it up with Christina? Happiness. Where is Christina? I ask again. Christopher was shaking with anger. She said she was waiting for me, dreaming of meeting me. And you're prying again. I do not know what you made up for yourself, but Christina has already married a foreigner 2 years ago and moved to France with him. She's not here. Why are you telling me fairy tales? Christopher was losing his temper. She wrote to me a month ago that she couldn't wait to meet me, that she loved me and everything like that. Maybe someone was just playing a joke on you, Betty suggested. The woman pulled out her phone and showed pictures of Christina standing in front of the Eiffel Tower in the arms of a man. Then pictures from the wedding. Christopher couldn't believe his eyes. How many years he'd been living in his imaginary world. He'd just been tricked, given false hopes. Did you set it all up? True to hissing irritation, Christopher spoke. Put me in jail and gave my daughter away quickly to someone else. How cleverly did you pull that off? No humanity at all. 5 years. 5 years I lived with the mere hope that Christina and I would be together. She should have been the one rotting in a cell, sharing her life with thieves and murderers. That was where she belonged. Betty did not portray a single emotion of restraint on her face. The woman could only be envied. Of course, she understood how hurt and resentful Christopher was right now, but there was nothing she could do about it. Christina was gone. She was never coming back, and she was never going to resume her relationship with Christopher. The girl didn't write him any letters. It was someone's evil joke. But you spent 5 years believing you were okay, said Betty. It's a lot easier to live knowing someone loves you and waits for you, and finding out that it's all a lie, you think, is easy and nice too. Realizing you've been living someone else's fantasy for 5 years. Christopher said it very well. He was suffering, and he couldn't hide it. The tears were flowing. The man could not hold them back. He raised his eyes to the sky and prayed that it would end, that someone would wake him up now and tell him that it was all just a terrible dream. Christina was really waiting for him and loving him. But no one woke him up. The dream was not interrupted. Betty closed the door and leaned her back against it. On the other side, she could feel Christopher pounding on the metal, heard him yelling and demanding to open it. The woman was crying. She knew he was hurting and hurt, but there was nothing she could do. Find words of support and comfort. Betty simply wasn't capable by nature. As Betty grew older, her fervor moderated a bit. She became sentimental. The woman clutched at her chest. Her heart ached for this man. She blamed herself for doing such a cruel thing to her son-in-law. Her conscience tormented her and prevented her from living. She did not love Christopher, but she believed that no one deserved such cruelty. Christopher sat under the gate all afternoon and evening. Betty went to the cameras to see if he had left, and each time she noticed that he hadn't. Christopher hadn't moved. She sighed heavily and moved on. In the morning, Christopher was not at the fence. The woman exhaled with relief. She would not be able to watch him suffer for another day, but she couldn't help him either. The daughter had left for good. She wouldn't go back, especially not for her ex-husband. He left already at night. He realized that there was no point in waiting. It was hard for a man to get used to the idea that the woman he loved did such a cruel thing to him. Who was writing letters on her behalf? He didn't want to find out. He liked to think that it was she who had confessed her love to him. Let everything remain as it was in his fantasies at least. Christopher continued his miserable existence in a small studio apartment with no one left. Friends had disappeared back in the days when Christina had been fine. He devoted too much time to work, did not have time to meet anyone. What was all this hardship and effort for? To end up with nothing, sitting alone in an empty apartment, living on disability allowance. Then he moved to the city. These thoughts tormented the unhappy man, but he decided that he would no longer give up. Let fate was cruel to him. He would no longer pour alcohol on his grief. He's already lost too much. Couldn't Christopher get a job? Injury prevented the disability allowance from being enough for a modest bachelor's life. Out of boredom, he started woodturning. He remembered that as a child he'd enjoyed it. He made portraits and paintings. Pretty soon the whole apartment was filled with his works. He posted them on his social network page. One day, his old acquaintance, Stephen, joined him as a friend. They corresponded for a long time. The man shared his story with his wife. They were doing well. They had 2 children. Christopher also told his sad fate. Stephen was very worried about his comrade. He decided to visit him to brighten the loneliness of an old friend. They talked all night. Stephen became interested in Christopher's hobby. He asked him to make a portrait of his wife. She was about to have a birthday. Then her girlfriends wanted one too. Stephen was happy to share his friend's contact with the women. They began to order portraits from Christopher. One of his clients was particularly interested in him. To be exact, not she herself, but the woman whose portrait he was doing. The woman had ordered a gift for a friend. Christopher found her profile from her photo and took a chance on writing. The woman's name was Kelly. She was the same age as the man, just as lonely. A friend had already told him about it. Christopher started a correspondence with Kelly. After 2 weeks of virtual communication, he decided to invite her on a date in person. The woman said yes. Christopher started courting her, sends flowers, invites her out on dates. Kelly didn't refuse his attention. She was a widow. Her husband passed away 5 years ago. She'd been lonely all that time, so the man's attention was nice to her. Despite the difficult life story, Christopher was not a bad man, so he was able to gain favor with Kelly. It had been a month since Christopher was a free and almost happy man. He continued to communicate with Kelly, but did not venture into a more serious step. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to provide for a woman again. He didn't want history to repeat itself. One day, someone knocked on the door of the apartment door. He opened it and saw an unfamiliar man in a suit and a very serious look. "Hello, Christopher," clarified the guest. "That's right, Christopher. I came to inform you that there is an inheritance in your name. Could you sign the papers and come to this address tomorrow?" The stranger held out a card with the address of the notary's office to draw up the documentation. This is a new kind of fraud. Christopher didn't believe the guest. "I have no one. Who would leave me an inheritance? All relatives of the dead. Why would I lie to you? Come back tomorrow, please." The man turned around and left. Christopher was left in complete incomprehension of what was happening. Maybe he had some uncle or aunt who could make a will, but he had never heard from his parents about kin. He decided to go after all to clarify the matter. After all, it was just curious. Even if it was a hoax, he would figure it out quickly. There was still nothing for him to do. The next day, Christopher dressed decently, even shaved and styled his hair. He wanted to look solid, so that the scammers did not consider him a simpleton. The man arrived at the address. Yesterday's stranger was already waiting for him. "You have been left a large sum of money in a house," said the man. "Now we will go to the house. You will see it, so that there will be no claims against us." Christopher got into the car with the stranger. He was surprised to see that he had been driven to Betty's house. He had lost all sense of direction. His mother-in-law had decided to play a joke on him again. Well, she wouldn't take it. Christopher was informed that this was the house he had inherited. He read the deeds and learned that Betty had made him heir to her entire fortune. How was that possible? Christopher could not believe what was happening. Finally, the man introduced himself. He was the woman's personal lawyer. Betty had died a week ago. She had been suffering from a heart condition for a long time and knew she didn't have long to live, which was why they were concerned about the will. To close any questions Christopher might have, she wrote him a letter. He opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Christopher, I have done many bad things to you. Now I want to make amends. It is a pity that I realized all my mistakes so late. Maybe if I had accepted you right away, all the misfortunes you had to go through would not have happened to you. And I realized that you are a good man. When you first brought John to me, Christina hated me, and you went along with it. As soon as you got in trouble at work, Christina immediately told me that she wanted to leave you and agreed to marry the man I grabbed her. But I refused, and I insisted that she had to help you. She didn't last long. As you remember, she left you anyway. When the car thing happened, I also asked her not to ruin your fate, but she insisted that you would agree. She also knew that you were a very good and reliable person. I believed and hoped until the last moment that you would say no. When you agreed to take the blame, I was once again convinced that I'd never met anyone worthy of you. It hurt so much when I watched you in court. I realized that your life was being ruined. Christina left for France almost immediately after your incarceration, and I made her come to the visits. I wrote those letters, but I didn't want you to be hurt. I wanted to do something to brighten your stay in the zone. Unfortunately, I haven't forgiven my daughter, and I won't. What she did to you was inhumane. To make it up to you, I've decided to leave the business, the house, and the savings to you. Christina won't get a penny from me. She doesn't even know I'm sick. We stopped communicating a long time ago. I think you can manage that money properly. You're not a stupid man. Forgive me if you can. And I want you to know that I love you like family. All my efforts to talk sense into my daughter have been pointless. It was my own fault, and I paid for it. After Christina went abroad, she didn't even call me once. I became useless too. I guess I deserved to be treated like that. I hope at least my memory will be good. I apologize. Once again, I hope you find happiness in this house. Did Christopher read the message from his mother-in-law? Tears were running down his cheeks. He recognized the handwriting immediately. For 5 years, he had stared at those letters in his prison cell, so everything written here was true. Christopher looked at the notary and waited for some comment. "Sign the papers now." That's all he said. Christopher silently took the pen and left his signature. He was now the rightful owner of this mansion. He went outside and looked at the pool where he was laying tiles. It was here that Christina stood and watched him. And here he sat and tried to furtively glance at the beautiful girl. I must remove this pool immediately so that it does not remind me of that time, Christopher thought. He went further to look around the rooms. In the study on the desk, he found his letters that he had addressed to Christina. Some of the letters were sprawled out. Apparently, whoever had read them earlier on the paper had tears. But it wasn't Christina. She hadn't even received them. Christopher realized how wrong he had been about Betty. How many curses had he wished upon her? She was his greatest enemy. He hated the woman. There were conflicting emotions inside him now. It turns out she was on his side almost all the time. He had so identified with Christina. She was willing to trade him for some old man for money, deprived Christopher of his son. Will he ever see him again? The lawyer said Christopher didn't have to worry about the business. There have been supervisors there for a long time who oversee the whole process. Christopher will only receive replenishment. There will be no need for his involvement. The lawyer himself will always be available. Christopher didn't move into the mansion right away. It took him a while to get used to the idea that he would now have a huge fortune. He didn't move in until a month later. In the meantime, he continued to care for Kelly. With the woman he loved, he did not share the news of his wealth. For the first time after the move, he hid from her new place of residence. When Christopher became convinced that Kelly was not interested in money, he decided to invite her to his luxurious house. Kelly did not change her attitude towards him. Christopher did not notice any change in her behavior either. When Christopher heard that Betty's lawyer would now work for him, he remembered his prison buddy Robert. He asked the specialist if there was any chance of getting the party an early release. "Anything can be done with your powers," the lawyer answered him. Christopher quickly recalled in his memory the name of Robert and gave the number of the colony where he was serving his sentence. The lawyer promised to solve this issue within a month. In fact, it took him only 1 week to release the guy. The case was not as complicated as it seemed at first glance. After being released, Robert was brought to visit his savior. "And you didn't tell me you lived so richly," amazed at the luxury of the mansion. "Robert, how can I ever thank you? Just try not to get into any more stories." Christopher laughed back. "And I got rich just recently." On top of that, Christopher decided to give Robert his old apartment. He had so much money now that there was no point in selling it. He could afford to buy 100 of these studios. It was sitting idle. Robert could not believe his good fortune. He fell to his knees in front of his savior and said thank you without stopping. Christopher got him a low-level position at his company. If he performs well, he'll eventually get a promotion. Under Christopher's leadership, you don't have to worry that someone will cheat or set him up again. Christopher's good deeds didn't end there. He decided to thank everyone who ever met him in life and showed him sympathy. The man did not forget about his friend, who once pulled him out of the village and helped him get settled in the city. Since Stephen had everything in life was good, he did not need money. Then Christopher decided to simply realize the dream of a school friend. He had always dreamed of seeing the ocean. The man paid for a fancy tour for him and his family. Stephen promised not to forget such a chic gesture and someday respond with the same wonderful gift. Christopher also remembered about his grandmother, who was saved in the forest. The same lawyer who had gotten Robert out of jail had helped him find her. The grandmother said she didn't need anything. She was already grateful for saving her life. But Christopher noticed that the house she was living in was about to collapse. He bought her a new place to live. The old lady recommended that Christopher run for mayor of the city. She would vote for a man with such a kind heart. Christopher just laughed in return. When all the good deeds were done, the space debts were paid back. Christopher thought about his own life. He was tired of being a bachelor. He dreamed of having a favorite woman at home with whom you can spend joint evenings, discuss the news. The man decided to make Kelly a proposal. He did it very beautifully in a chic restaurant with live music and a huge bouquet of flowers. Of course, the woman could not refuse her favorite man. A year and a half later, Kelly and Christopher got married. The wedding they played chickly. Finally, he had everything he dreamed of, and even more. A wife he loved, a beautiful big house where he and his wife had remodeled. Was Christopher happy? So much torment and suffering he had to endure. Now he could breathe and live in peace. Who would have thought that he would help realize the dreams of Betty, who at first hated him? Did Christopher visit her grave more than once, talk to her? Said he was sorry they'd never been able to resolve their differences while she was alive. She must have been a good person too, or she just wouldn't have done that to him. The man held no grudges against Christina. He considered himself above it. If she thought him unworthy of her heart, her right. He was still grateful to her for a few happy years and together. Did they have anything to remember? Maybe one day they would meet and apologize to each other. 12 years have passed. Kelly Eel's life flowed calmly and measuredly. They had traveled halfway around the world and had made a lot of impressions. It was a frosty winter day. They didn't want to go outside. Suddenly, someone disturbed the couple's peaceful vacation. A young boy came to visit Christopher. The man immediately recognized him. "John," joyfully exclaimed Christopher, "what have you become? Grown up already?" The young man rushed to his father's neck. He said that his mother did not let him go to Christopher. He was looking forward to coming of age to meet his father, whom he didn't remember at all. He hadn't expected to see him here. After all, Christina had told him that Grandma lived in this house. So many years had passed, and she didn't even know that her mother had died. The son told her that her mother divorced the Frenchman. She works as a waitress and doesn't live in luxury. Dreamed of all his life. The young man pays his own tuition and helps his mom, but she still doesn't want to come home. Christopher promised that he would take care of his son's tuition. He also said that Christina can come to visit him and talk to him if she has such a desire. Christopher is willing to help her as well. John visited his father for only a week, but he left, promising to come and visit several times a year. The young man lived in France, studied at the university there. Now, Christopher could say with certainty that he was the happiest man on earth, because his greatest wish had come true. He began to communicate with his son.